I'm Barrie Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barrie.
Welcome to Back Barries, a podcast from Guardian Australia. And today we're recording live from the Sydney Writers' Festival at Carriageworks, a live and hopefully lively audience. And we're going to start, of course, with the budget wash-up and the reception it's received. And it's been pretty weird to me. I mean, normally these things are fairly predictable. The government tells you what's in the budget, there's a bit of a debate around it, and then it's legislated and you move on. This time you got the impression the government just sort of, certainly from parts of the media and the stakeholders, so the government simply put a series of ideas on the table. Now go for it and have a chat about it. It's the debate following the announcements have been quite extraordinary. As best you can tell, though, Tony, what's the response? The polls seem to be fairly mixed. What are you picking up?
Yeah, it's always confused information systems that people sort of follow. Everybody's in different media ecosystems these days. The good old days, Barrie, of the 90s when, you'd give something to the print and they'd run it, the radios would pick it up and then the TVs would follow, and it was a 24-hour news cycle. And now it just sort of atomizes and there's all sort of different ecosystems where people operate. And so, for example, this rise of the social media influencers, people I've never heard of who've got 500,000 followers, and I'm a pretty high-end consumer of media. So, one of those classic examples is, there's been a lot of unhappiness about startups and shares, the CGT treatment of those. And, there are some fin-influencers in that space who've been whipping up younger investors because they put savings into shares or startups or whatever, and so they're very animated. But and the difficult thing for media and us as pollsters is working out, is this sort of high volume, low reach. But there's I sort of said to one of our staff who's on the border of Gen Z and millennials, and he invests a little bit, and I sort of said, what people like Mark Burris, and he was like, no mate, that's what people like you. He said, there's a whole bunch of things like Equity Mates was one of the ones that he sort of said has got 250,000 followers. So very fragmented media operating space.
Particularly impressive with the 40 entrepreneurs, all under 40, right? Very, very cute. I don't quite understand the relevance of that, but they were all under 40, and they were saying that the capital gains tax or the removal of the concession was going to cost this country a lot of great ideas. I don't get how, if they still come up with their ideas and they can make a profit but just pay a little bit more tax on that profit, that they're going to abandon the whole idea and go and drive Ubers. I really don't think that was a convincing argument.
Well, I think, there's enough evidence to suggest that people are looking at different options, whether it be Singapore, New Zealand, of course, which doesn't have that taxation treatment. So I wouldn't rule it out. I mean, there's always consequences to a tax imposition. It could be a positive, it could be overall positive, but there's always going to be consequences.
It's already being written into the narrative. This has gone over like a lead balloon, right? That the country hates it. The news poll, good or bad, right? 48% bad, 39% good. But then they did a bit of a deep dive and asked a whole series of questions and came to the conclusion it's the worst budget since 1993, even worse than Joe Hockey's budget in 2014. And that's the budget, of course, where Joe Hockey and Matthias Cormann were there smoking cigars and celebrating the fact that they'd put on a $7 Medicare co-payment, they'd raised income taxes by 2%, an emergency budget levy was imposed. I mean, really, that's a budget that did hit everybody. And now they're saying that this has gone over worse than that.
Well, that's the initial response. The thing with the 2014 budget was Abbott spent basically 2-3 years tearing down Gillard and then Rudd over there'll be no carbon tax under my government. So they sort of tore her down over that broken promise, and then basically the first thing they did when they got into office was break a promise. And so, that sort of undermined his whole narrative. But the other big mistake, again, you're talking about that initial snapshot, Abbott bled on that. And Albanese, whatever you want to say, I think Albanese is a bit of a policy dilettante, but he understands the process of Parliament. He's been there for 30 years as a former manager of government business, and he knows that he needs to pass this as quickly as possible and move on. and he knows that the Greens are more than likely to agree to almost everything that he polled up to the budget, and he might make some concessions on some CGT aspects, he might, but he knows the Greens will pass it, and he'll try to move the conversation on so he's not bleeding to death like Abbott did. So I think initially, the responses are probably accurate, but it's how it plays out in the next couple of years.
Yeah, but in the interest of accuracy, though, you go to the other poll, and that's the Resolve poll in the 9 newspapers. They answer direct questions around support for the individual budget items. Negative gearing, support 35, oppose 21. Capital gains tax, support 36, oppose 21. Family trust, support 34, oppose 23. In all of those cases, there's almost twice as much support as opposition. I don't see then how you can draw from that it's gone over really badly, that people hate it, as they say. But this, and I want to ask you this as a pollster yourself, that category where people say they're undecided or they're neutral, you never want to see that as a really large category, do you?
No, it's the undecided, which means it's contestable. So there's a big, it's around a third are yet undecided. So that's why it's so important for the government to be out there talking their messages, the opposition likewise, getting into all those sort of media ecosystems, so the different sort of cohorts of the Australian population are consuming your message and hearing your persuasive arguments. So again, the initial response might have been lukewarm, but the government will be doing their best to sell it positively and hoping to change those numbers so those undecided start moving into their column.
But are they undecided? I mean, it's so many of them. It's almost half the country in this poll. And you could say undecided or whatever, but it's more, I think, either they don't care or they haven't got a clue what you're talking about. The issue is just complex and they're not that interested in it. And I think that, again, is worth throwing into the mix if you're trying to figure out what the country as a whole thinks. The Oz had a story saying that 740,000 wage earners are going to be hit by the capital gains tax. 740,000. That means 13 million are not. And that's why, I think the whole response to it can be exaggerated. It's not, you pick up the newspapers and you think the government's got the weight of the world on its hands at the moment, and it must be sitting there saying, can we really swing all this in a reverse, or do we stick with our guns? Of course they'll stick with their guns.
Albo does have a habit of coming out with something and then backtracking very quickly. I think the $3 million superannuation was an example of that, but I think
the Royal Commission was another one that was raised as an example of that. The Herald Sun suggested he'll cave in because he did on the Royal Commission. This is a completely different set of circumstances.
Yeah, there was, some briefings that Treasury changed the initial proposition. They just wanted to make CGT on property, and then Treasury expanded it. My experience of dealing with Treasury is they'll always go for a bigger revenue option. So I thought that was interesting, that Chalmers effectively sort of decided to take the advice of Treasury on that. I'm not sure there's a compelling reason for that. Their whole argument is that, and I've said this myself for many years now, that, we've got the situation where income is taxed at a different rate to property and wealth. And so, you can effectively, and the government's used this example. They've sort of said, I can be a salary earner, working as a nurse, working very hard, and I'm taxed on $100,000 a year. Or I can be sitting at home and earning $100,000 of investments and earn a completely different taxation rate and sort of sit on the couch and watch replays of Brisbane Broncos premiership. It's not not a particularly fair sort of situation. So but there was a compelling reason for that. But whether you start sort of changing it onto other aspects of the economy, I'm not sure that's a brilliant idea.
What has struck me about this time around, though, is that the capital gains issue is very different in terms of how it's being treated as to 2019 when Bill Shorten virtually lost an election over it. That hasn't got the bite, it hasn't got the sting this time around. The focus is more on, well, if you look at where the focus went, in the first week it went on broken promises in terms of how the media presented it. That was the big argument against it. It's a broken promise and they'll live to rue the day. And then the second week it was about, well, look at the polls. People hate it. So they're going to have to backtrack. The substance was kind of missing. But when you do look at it, the negative gearing aspect hasn't got the bite that it had in 2019, and I think people have probably moved on, and for good reason. because that has distorted the taxation system now for 30 years. It's favoured only investors, and it's made owner-occupiers and young people, it's made it that much harder for them to get into housing. It created basically a nation of speculators, and it had to go, and it's gone. That won't come back. And my prediction is that the opposition will go to the next election and they'll promise to restore negative gearing, and they won't win the next election, and Labor will probably get back with roughly the kind of majority it's got now, and you won't hear from it again. That's negative gearing gone. Capital gains tax, I think, is slightly different, and there might be some. The opposition might stick with it for a little longer than they will the negative gearing. Do you think that's an area that they would enthusiastically go after? Because, look, you still have to weigh up the fact that they're going to spend all of this valuable time in the campaign trail virtually arguing the case for investors. Is that what they really want to do?
Yeah, I think there's no compelling reason to keep negative gearing anymore. It was good as a way of, encouraging people to invest, secure their futures, and I think it's done that to a large extent. But there's been supply issues with housing, and there's been also demand issues. So I don't think that's, there's very few people out there arguing that it's a bad idea what they've done there. If I was the opposition, though, I would support it, but then say we're going to offset that with revenue gains in terms of income tax cuts. So we'll give those younger people an opportunity to get into wealth accumulation by allowing them to keep more of their income. In terms of capital gains tax, I think the other danger for the government is you never want to be breaking a promise. It's easier to break a promise of something you say you'll do than break a promise of something you say you won't do. So if you say, no Australian child will live in poverty, which I know was an aspirational thing. Sorry to bring up that post-traumatic stress for you, Barrie. It's only been 40 years, so. But if you say you're going to fix up wait times, elective surgery, I think there's a different scale for which judges will vote you. But when you say repeatedly, for the 50th time, we're not going to do that, like Albanese did, that turns into memes. Memes turns into messages on the internet, and these days messages they spread faster than the internet. So
it depends, of course, on what the promise is and what the end result is. When the Albanese government promised that it wouldn't change the tax scales that they'd inherited from the coalition, and then they broke that promise and they changed the scales, and they were able to say to people, sorry, we're breaking our promise. We're not giving you the tax cut we promised you, we're giving you a bigger one. Now, that's an easy promise to break. But even when you do break them, when John Howard in 1976 talked about core and non-core promises, core and non-core, right? And that was a shocker, and he had to sort of live with that for a while. But that was in his first 3 months in office, and he was there for 11 years. So you can exaggerate, too, at the impact of broken promises. It depends in the end on what promise you're breaking and what you're leaving them with, where you land in the end.
I think, the coalition's position is obviously incredibly dire, and we've got some interesting polling coming out very, very shortly, which is, it's not shocking when you think about it, but it shows the diabolical nature that the coalition is in. So I'm not suggesting that the coalition have Labor on the ropes. Albanese has 94 seats, but I think there's always a risk, though. I'm always reminded of 2004 when you have an unexpected victory. In 2004, we won the Senate. Ironically, we won the fourth spot in Queensland, which happened to be a bloke called Barnaby Joyce. I'm not sure if you've heard of him. In hindsight, that was probably an election to lose in terms of the Senate spot there. But Howard then, having won the Senate, a majority, then decided to go for work choices. Sometimes having an unexpected win like 94 seats and effective control of the Senate, because Albanese only needs to negotiate with the Greens, sometimes that can cause you to overreach. So I do wonder if Albanese is overreaching on this.
You listen to Barnaby Joyce, though, you mentioned him, and he was arguing the other day that the whole concept of capital gains, what annoys him about it is people have worked hard all their lives, they've paid their taxes, and they've paid their taxes once, and they save this money, and then they invest it, and they get taxed again. Well, yes, they do. They get taxed on the profits from their investments. And he was kind of arguing that in itself is an unfair thing, not that suddenly the tax has been increased on those profits. And that's the kind of misinformation that goes out there. On Channel 7 on The Breakfast Show, they're having the argument over the same thing, well, more related to negative gearing, I guess. And the host was saying, we've got so many emails from people saying that their rents have gone up. Already, the landlords have raised the rents. And Claire O'Neill, the minister, was trying to explain, but with no chance, with the cacophony of sound, but hang on, landlords who have renters now and have their properties negatively geared, still negatively gear. It's grandfathered. They haven't been affected by 1 cent, so why are they raising their rents? They can't. And if they do, they can't use negative gearing or these changes as an excuse. But that's the kind of just ill-informed conversation that's going on at the moment.
But that's the nature of the modern media cycle now.
Well, it is.
People source their information from their preferred news sources. I think it's going to be.
Although television's been around a long time, you'd think they'd start to get it right.
Yeah, but I think this is going to be interesting because I think there's so much misinformation out there now that I've got the most bizarre algorithm in social media because I follow Labor people, Liberal people, and all sorts of different things. So I get all sorts of things thrown up at me. And I've reached a point where I just need to double check it with a legacy media source because they're so compelling and convincing, but I've never heard of the source. And you sort of wonder how many people are sort of stuck in this algorithm and getting what's effectively wrong information from the left and the right. And I think that was also feeding this incredible fragmentation of the vote because fragmented media markets means fragmented media consumption, means fragmented voting patterns. So I do wonder if people will start sort of saying, hang on, I don't trust this information source anymore. I need to go back to, I might not like the ABC or the Guardian or the Sydney Morning Herald or the Australian, but I think they usually get it right.
Mm. The polling you mentioned before, and I'm not asking you to break your embargo because you've got obligations to media companies and so on with this material. But you mentioned that it's not particularly good for the coalition, but can you just say in broad terms, because the big question is whether One Nation can convert a theoretical polling primary vote in the 20s to seats. Well, we've seen that they can. We saw it in Farrer. Broadly speaking, they can.
Yep.
According to your polling?
Yep. They can. They absolutely can. So it stands to reason if you're coming second in the national sample polls, you're going to do very well in terms of seats because if you're polling at 25 and 28% nationally, you're obviously going to be polling at high 30s and 40s in some seats, and therefore you're going to win.
But isn't the reality, though, what's going on? I mean, Nikki Sutter wrote a book called Earthquake, and people are talking about how it's the most fundamental shift in the political landscape in many decades, and it probably is. But it's worth keeping in mind that it's a shift that is happening essentially on the conservative side of politics. That at its essence, what's really going on is that the spoils of opposition are being shared. It's not necessarily a movement that will threaten government. It's about who will pick up the pieces.
No, it's a threat
on the coalition side,
it's a threat to both sides.
On the conservative side.
The coalition is the obvious and early casualty, but there's clear signs that Labor are also in the gun. And we saw it in South Australia, one of the safest Labor seats. He only won by 500 votes over the One Nation candidate. Hunter is a seat which I think up in Newcastle, Joel Fitzgibbon's old seat, which I think is in diabolical trouble. In the last election, that was a two-party preferred contest between Labor and One Nation. It would be a mistake of Labor, and the smart people in Labor know that they're in trouble as well. I mean, you only need to look at Keir Starmer. I mean, he was only elected less than 2 years ago. And I mean, he's not going to make it to his second anniversary, I don't think, which is
thanks to his own party. But
his numbers are
what I'm saying that with
and
Labor, I think there's a handful of seats around the country. There's a seat called Hawke in Victoria, which I think is prime for that kind of assault that you're talking about that might happen in Hunter. But I think you're picking one or two seats around the country in various states, whereas the real revolution is going on the other side when there could be 25 seats up for grabs.
No, there's obviously One Nation's lowest hanging fruit is in the regions. I think, Barnaby was being the performative type of guy that he is by saying Western Sydney, we're coming after you. There are a few seats on the table in Western Sydney, where economic anxiety and insecurity is particularly acute, and so voters are looking for, easy answers. And I think that's one lesson out of not just Australia, but also UK and the United States. Nigel Farage, for example, or Keir Starmer and Anthony Albanese. I think, this easy answers brigade. There's an easy answer to everything. And of course, when they get in and the voters quickly realise actually there was no easy answers, and things are still grim financially. And there's an entrenched pessimism in the electorate. We've asked people, it came out of focus groups, do you think the next generation will be better off, worse off, or the same? 56% said worse off. So it's not just like, it's a bad year this year, a few economic headwinds, Iran and so forth. It's like, no, this is ongoing. And that's fueling this discontent. So it's a huge mistake to think that One Nation is just cannibalising coalition votes. It is doing untold damage to them, but the smart people in Labor know that they're next.
Let's have a look at the budget and reply and the responses so far to the initiatives that were proposed there. First, the one that links the migration numbers to housing supply. Now, a couple of economists have had a good look at this. Alan Kohler, for one, Stephen Koukoulas. And what they've found that you can go back 50 years and make the comparisons, and housing supply has always exceeded migration numbers. You go back 10 years, same thing. Go back the last 12 months, same thing. Housing supply actually exceeds migration numbers. So how do you reduce migration under that formula? And surely that's now a problem for Angus Taylor, that in fact, by some calculations, he'd have to increase migration to 600,000 if he wanted to be true to his formula.
Yeah.
I mean, that one, I think, is going to be quietly shelved.
And then we have massive labour market problems because, a lot of these migrants fill really important jobs.
Yeah. The one area, though, where I think he's onto something, even if it's no more than a theoretical debate, and perhaps that's all it will be in the end, but that's on bracket creep. And Paul Kelly has described it in The Australian as one of the bravest calls in history. And it is in this sense that because it's a shift away from responsibility. Like at the moment, governments have been happy to not to pass on negative gearing by mandate. They like to have the flexibility so they can decide how much they pass back to the taxpayers. But what Angus Taylor is saying, no, we're going to mandate it. We're going to fix it so that it automatically flows on. So that's a fundamental shift in how governments approach taxation. And I think that's going to resonate for a while. Now, whether it brings about those sort of dramatic changes, and first of all, he's got to get into government. But it's interesting that the hook in it, of course, is that if you do that, initially they'd lose about $20 billion in revenue. Now that's a lot of revenue. You've got to get some of that back, and to get that back, you've got to cut spending. You've got to reduce services. But it's an interesting debate, and I don't think he's losing points by putting it out there.
No, I think he's given the Liberal base something to talk about as well as his colleagues. You always want your colleagues talking about a policy idea that they believe in, because if they're not talking about that, they'll start talking about your leadership. They'll get on the phone to one of them. How do you think Barrie's going? Oh, not too great, And because there's I think Sam Gastiari. I did a dinner function with him once, which was great fun because he's hilarious, but he's quite brilliant. But he talked about the 5 stages in destabilising a leadership. Sort of starts off like, things need to change. That was obviously.
That's why they hire these guys. They've got 5 stages of bringing down leaders.
Yep. So obviously, Jane Hume, I think you used that one. Things need to change, and then they start talking about, their office is no good. You never want to attack the leader because it sounds disloyal, but you start talking about, I don't think his office is working very well, and then you identify a particular individual, the chief of staff or something. They're a problem, and then bang, you're dead. So, so Angus has given us something to talk about, but I still don't think he's going to make it to the finish line. I think we're still looking at a 3-litre term.
Well, if that's the case, like at the moment he's saying, he said an interesting thing the other night on Sky. when he said that certain Liberals should not have distanced themselves from Donald Trump during the last election campaign. I'm not sure who those people were who did try and build a bit of distance. I mean, Peter Dutton's problem was that he didn't. But Angus Taylor said straight out, I won't be doing that. I won't be building distance from Donald Trump. Was that a direct reference, do you think, to Andrew Hasty? Now, I'm not sure whether Andrew Hasty did during the campaign, but he certainly has since.
Yeah. We put out a poll just recently that the greatest hesitation amongst One Nation voters, at around a third of One Nation voters, was Pauline Hanson's support for Donald Trump and her support for sending troops to Iran to assist in opening up the Straits. And that causes about a third to reflect and reconsider. Now, Hasty was straight out of the gun, went into ABC studios in Perth and sort of said, Hanson is MAGA first, Australia second. Look, Donald Trump's numbers in Australia, and we test them every month, is net minus 58. I think it's like 74 unfavourable and about 16 favourable. So I don't know who Angus thinks he's winning over by cuddling up to Trump. I mean, the guy is radioactive. So, I just sort of think Hasty's reading the play a little bit better on that. But obviously, Hasty has upset the base with his. He was a witness against Ben Roberts-Smith, which has upset a lot of people. He's disagreed with Gina Rinehart on a few things, which is always a little bit dangerous in WA if you're a Liberal. So, which I think speaks to he's prepared to take a bit of a crack. But he's the obvious replacement for Angus, I think.
The other thing that Angus Taylor said, he said a couple of things, but earlier in the week he said that forming a coalition with One Nation is nonsense. And then a couple of days later he said on Sky, well, he wouldn't rule it out. And he said, I'll work with whoever I can to stop Labor. So again, it's this whole, they get in a mess over preferences, and now whether or not they will discuss the possibility of a coalition with One Nation. How do they handle that issue? And should he close the option off or leave it open, and just depending on the circumstances they find themselves in?
They'll probably be the junior partner. So, not really sure. Not really
There's
sure
another hint for what the poll might say.
Yeah.
But then again, it's a live issue, and it's one they're going to have to face. And at the moment, they're just trying to avoid it, and they seem to have different points of view on it. So, at some stage, the discipline's going to have to kick in, and they'll have to come up with a firm position on how they deal with One Nation. It's pretty big. The other thing that he said, and he said he had enormous respect for Liberal voters who have or are considering defecting to One Nation. Now, at first blush, that might sound like an odd thing to say. I've got enormous respect for the people who have left our party and are now supporting One Nation. But you remember, like Tina McQueen, who was Vice President of the Liberal Party and is now just defected to One Nation. When the moderates left and went to the Teal, she waved them goodbye and said, good riddance. The worst possible approach, that not only will we never adjust our party to suit your needs, but we're just glad to see the last of you. So that was the wrong way. And by the way, she was so happy that all of these moderates have left and the party became more right-wing, and she still left. So some people are hard to please. But you can understand now why he has said that he's still got respect for the Liberal voters and he's keeping the doors open for them.
Yeah, you've always got to give soft voters a pathway back, and that's clearly what he's trying to do. But I think all sides, including Labor, are misreading the median One Nation voter. Some people like to sort of be reductive and say it's immigration is driving that, but it's far more complex than that. For a lot, Pauline Hanson is their wrecking ball. She is their truth teller. For others, it's just a rejection of the two-party system. It's frustration with both of them promising things and then not being seen to deliver those things. So there's a lot of, and it's all underpinned by economic anxiety. They're just very, and it's a narrative. You'll hear politicians start using it a lot because we get in focus groups all the time. I do the right thing. I work hard. I've paid my taxes. I've educated my kids. I'm in private health insurance to give myself a bit of choice and flexibility and take pressure off the public health system. But I can never get ahead. I feel like, everything's working against me. Governments are making life harder. And there's this, just pent up frustration that voters have right now. And, we're seeing it in the United Kingdom, United States, and I think it's going to start taking off here. It's been slower in Australia, I think, because we have a compulsory voting system, but it's going to take off.
Yeah. We talk about Taylor and Hasty. What about Abbott and Downer in the battle for the presidency? Who have you got your money on?
I never thought I'd be on Team Downer, but but here I am. So just let that wash over you. But I mean, this speaks to the modern Liberal Party. Is that Downer? I've read that Downer is the candidate of the left. The left.
Yeah.
I mean, there must be a different Alexander Downer, but.
The one thing that Alexander Downer has already said about this contest is that people have to understand the role of the president is an administrative one, and they're not there to come in and try and dictate policy to the rest of the party. Well, I wonder who he's talking about there, because clearly you know how Tony Abbott operates, and he would move in as a second leader, wouldn't he?
Yeah, I mean, Tony views politics as a vocation, and he's always feels that he needs to help shape the debate, for better or worse. I mean, that's a good thing that he feels like it's important to put voices out there, even if you agree with them or disagree with them. But as a leader operating, the last thing you need is the federal president coming out and basically doing media all the time. I think I'm reliably told that John Howard is backing Downer. Howard realises that despite his fondness for Abbott, I think didn't he sort of once say that Abbott was a love child of Bronwyn Bishop and John Howard? But I think Howard realises that if the Liberal Party is to survive, Downer is probably the better option. Yeah.
You were talking the other day about leadership changes, and I'm just wondering which party tends to engage in that practice more than the other. For me, it took a bit of getting used to because I was born in 1950. I was 16 before I had a second Prime Minister. It was Robert Menzies all the way through to that time, but things have changed. You've got some figures on the sort of hurdy-gurdy nature of political leadership.
Yeah, one of the things that comes up in research, I mean, the Liberal Party and Labor have got many problems right now with the public, perceptual issues. There's many different components to why the Liberal Party is in the trouble they're in. I always say it's like an episode of air crash investigations. It's rarely just one problem that's caused the catastrophe. But one of those issues is the accumulated scar tissue of leadership changes. So if you go back to June 2013, when Rudd 2.0 came back after Gillard, subsequent to that, we've had 16 leadership changes in Australia at federal and state levels. So 16 in 13 years, just under 13 years. Of those 16 changes, 9 have been actual leadership contests, spills, and 7 have been the faux kind of leadership thing. And we saw that with Mark Speakman here in New South Wales. There wasn't a contest. He stood down because he didn't have the numbers and tried to make it an orderly transition. So there's been 16 leadership changes, 9 contests and 7 effective contests. 13 have been Liberal Party changes of leadership. Amongst those contests, 8 out of 9 have been Liberal Party. So I think that is adding to the sort of scar tissue that the Liberal Party now has from voters who, it's just damaged their brand. They seem to be dysfunctional. I think Victoria, I've lost count of how many leadership changes we've had. And it's just adding to this sort of view that the Liberal Party aren't ready for government.
Yeah. Finally on that, in response to that, I looked up the UK situation in recent times, and you have had, they have 5-year terms, so they should be better at it than Australia, and Tony Blair had 10 years, and Margaret Thatcher and so on, but in recent, Theresa May 3 years, Boris Johnson 3 years, Liz Truss 49 days, Rishi Sunak 2 years, and now Keir Starmer less than 2 years with a whopping majority and 3 years ahead of him without an election is in trouble. So it's not just a disease that Australia has caught. Right, questions?
Yeah, a question to Tony Barrie. Tony, during podcasts back to Back Barries, in the lead up to the Farrer by-election, a couple of the references you made to the Teals made it pretty clear, well, to me at least, that you had a view of where the Teals stand in the political spectrum. How is that, and how is it changing as we head into metropolitan contests which will involve one nation?
Yeah, I think one of the things, and I worked in the Howard government at Crosby Textor in the 2000s, we started seeing it back then. There was a disconnect in the Teal seats. There started becoming a disconnect with voters and the Liberal Party's base. It was pejoratively called doctors' wives. Now, I always hasten to add pejorative, and 52% of medical graduates are female, by the way, so should be doctors' husbands. But you know, there was a decision made that rather than trying to bring those voters back, just to pivot off them and go out to the western suburbs, outer suburbs, and pivot off the sort of inner city elites, I guess, for want of a better term. And then kind of, you know, that sort of disconnect, values disconnect continued. The same-sex marriage debate in 2016 had far more impact on the Teal result in 2022 than I think most people realise. For a lot of people, it's like any marriage or relationship breakdown. It's rarely just sort of, you know, overnight. It's an accumulation over time. And for a lot of voters, that sort of spoke to a disconnect in values, and then it manifested itself in 2022 with a changed result in those seats. So I don't think, we always talk about Australia as a nation of smaller and smaller tribes, and the shared values in those electorates are very different than, say, regional and rural Australia. And I think that fragmentation is going to continue.
If I can ask you both to use your crystal balls, in 2031, the first voters in Generation Alpha will be voting. What further stresses do you think that will place on the two political parties, particularly the coalition?
Right up your alley, Tony.
I always remind Liberals who, you know, they look at the vote intentions of Gen Z, which are, you know, very much on a two-party basis geared towards Labor. And Gen Z women is the base of the Greens vote, and it can be up to 35 to 40% on any particular cycle. So it's very bad, you know, and millennials are a little bit better, but not much better, and that goes up to the age of 40. At the next, I think at 2031, it will be around half of the electorate will be Gen Z and millennial. And I keep on reminding Liberal MPs, mate, there's 5 more years of Gen Z. They're 13 right now. So you think it's bad now, like, you know, wait until 5 years' time when these 13-year-olds get on the electoral roll. And I don't see too many of these 13, 14-year-old Gen Zs voting Coalition, by the way. So, and again, like, you know, I think Coalition don't know how to communicate with that group. They don't know how to find them, you know, for a start, and get into those algorithms. So, you know, the Coalition has enormous challenges. I mean, I wouldn't say they're in palliative care, but they're unalive.
So they should be in palliative care.
Yeah.
Well, that's it for today. Thank you, everybody, for rolling up at such an early hour. We really appreciate it. This podcast was recorded at the Sydney Writers' Festival, and we thank them for their tremendous cooperation, and it was on the sovereign lands of the Gadigal people. It was produced by Daniel Simo, video production Charisma Luthria, Yuji Shimada and Aston Brown.
Executive producer is Hannah Parks.
I'm Barrie Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barrie. This is Back Barries, a Guardian Australia podcast.
Thanks, everybody.